Now, obviously, there's a lot of sad verses in the Bible, but one that has always stood out to me is in fact a rather obscure one. You've probably have never even read it. It's found in the very last letter that we have of the Apostle Paul, called 2 Timothy. Paul is in prison in Rome, awaiting to be tried and ultimately executed for his faith. And he says at the end of the letter to Timothy, "Come to me quickly, for Demas, who is in love with this present world, has abandoned me and is gone to Thessalonica." Okay, that's actually two verses, verse 9 and 10 of chapter 4, but hey, who's counting?
Now, it certainly wasn't unusual for Paul to be in prison for his faith. In fact, he spent several years in various prisons throughout the Roman Empire. Now, from a human point of view, we would think, what a waste. Why would God allow his greatest spokesperson to be locked away in a cell somewhere when he could be out there preaching the gospel? Well, we must remember that God's ways are not always our ways. For starters, if it wasn't for his various imprisonments, we wouldn't have 2 Timothy, would we? Nor would we have Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. There would be a big hole left in the New Testament canon if it wasn't for these imprisonments. And secondly, Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 17, that on my account you'll be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. Something that we conveniently overlook here in the Western Church is that persecution is one of the greatest forms of evangelism. Take, for example, when Paul was thrown in prison in Jerusalem, which is recorded in Acts chapters 21 through 26. Paul had been arrested in the Jewish temple, and over the course of the next several years, he testified before two Roman governors, Felix and Festus, as well as King Agrippa. Now, because it was a court of law, Paul was required to clearly state his case for Christianity in front of these men. And after appealing to have his case heard before Caesar, who was in Rome, the book of Acts ends off on a very positive note. Even though he was under house arrest for 2 years, people were free to come and go and to listen to whatever Paul had to say. And it is at that time that many scholars believe that Paul wrote his famous letter to the Philippians, where he mentions how because of his imprisonment, he was able to preach the gospel to Caesar's household, and he was able to preach the gospel to the entire palace guard. Now, the palace guard consisted of several thousand men, each one having to take turns guarding the most famous evangelist of all time. Clearly, many of these people would never have come into contact with the gospel, whether governors or soldiers, if it wasn't for Paul being thrown into the slammer. And yet, when we come to 2 Timothy, this last letter that we have of the Apostle Paul, it's very clear that this imprisonment was very different from all the others. For starters, gone were the crowds that had once flocked to hear this great man preach. And it seems as though very few people even knew where Paul was being held. And yet, do you know what the most difficult aspect of this imprisonment was for Paul? Just as Jesus' own disciples had abandoned him during his greatest hour of need in the Garden of Gethsemane, so too with Paul. Much of the church, including some of his closest associates, simply left Paul to rot in jail. Now, obviously, we do need to take into account what was going on at the time. Obviously, there was a great persecution breaking out upon the church. Nero had become emperor, and even by ancient Roman standards, he was considered pretty much a psychopath. In the aftermath of the great fires of Rome, Nero blamed the Christians. And one particular form of brutality that he seemed to enjoy employing was tying Christians up on poles and then setting them on fire alive, using them as human torches to light up his gardens at night. So okay, who was Demas? You know, that guy that I mentioned about at the start of this video. Well, unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about him. Paul did mention his name in two of his other letters, Colossians and Philemon. But what we can gather from these two short verses in 2 Timothy is that obviously he must have been very important to Paul. Otherwise, why would Paul even write Timothy urging him to come as quickly as possible because Demas had left him? And what was Paul meaning when he said of Demas that because he loved this present world that he had abandoned Paul and had gone to Thessalonica? Was Paul meaning that Demas had completely given up on the faith, that he went to Thessalonica to sow his wild oats? Or was Paul meaning that Demas, like so many other Christians, didn't want to take the risk of dying a martyr's death? Given the context, it's probably this latter scenario. Okay, so now it's time to bring what we've learned from the first century into the 21st century. My question for you is this: assuming that your pastor is a man of God who faithfully preaches from the scriptures, in the troubling days ahead, are you going to be willing to stand by him at all cost? I'm sorry to sound like a prophet of doom here, but it is time for we as Western Christians to wake up and take a look at our surrounding culture. that our culture is no longer merely being indifferent to the gospel, but in fact being outright hostile. And this shouldn't surprise us. Jesus said if they hated him, then they will hate us. And Paul said to Timothy that whoever wants to live a godly life will be persecuted. So in these troubling days ahead, are you going to be willing to stand by your pastor? Are you going to be a Timothy to your pastor? Or are you going to be a Demas?